Hi everybody, this is International Master Atanu and you are watching my channel The Philo Chess. In this video, I shall present a very instructive game played by former world champion Anatoly Karpov against his opponent Wolfgang Unzicker from Germany. This game is very instructive because it will teach us how to handle space advantage from white side of Ruy Lopez Opening. Let's start the game. White opened with e4. After e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, we reach the starting position of the Ruy Lopez opening, which is named after a Spanish priest who wrote a manuscript on chess about 500 years ago. It is indeed very admirable that 500 years ago a priest wrote a book on chess without the availability of free information which we have today. The first important moment of the game or of the Ruy Lopez opening main line arises after fifth move by black. Here white has to defend his e-pawn and he decides to play rook e1 instead of knight c3 or d3. Well, although both the moves are perfectly playable, but most white players prefer to play rook e1. The reason behind preference of rook e1 is that one of the main ideas in the main lines of Ruy Lopez is to build a classical pawn center by playing d4 supported by a pawn on c3, so that in case of exchange the pawn on c3 replaces the pawn on d4. What is a classical pawn center? Whenever we have two pawns side by side on the central square, we call it a classical pawn center. Why are such a classical pawn center considered to be advantageous? Well, the reason is if we have two pawns in the center, we control four very important central squares in front of the pawn by these pawns. So that will prevent the opponent pieces from coming on those four squares. That is why having possession of a classical center is considered to be so good. It prevents opponent's pieces coming forward. Also, if the pawns are given liberty to move forward, they can push back the opponent's pieces, creating attacking chances. Therefore, one of the ideas, the main idea of Ruy Lopez, in contrast to, say, the Scotch game or the Four Knights game, is to have a classical pawn center, and that is why the move knight c3 or d3 do not fit into white's main idea, because in this case the idea of c3 and d4 is difficult to execute. Well, after rook e1 we arrive at, after the eighth move by black, we arrive at another very important moment of the game. See, instead of walking through the game move by move, because it's a very long game, I would prefer to concentrate and focus on only the most important positions, the critical positions which will enhance our understanding of Ruy Lopez, and let us understand the concepts behind the opening rather than memorizing moves. And we can only admire Anatoly Karpov. The way he handled the game was really worthy of him being a world champion. Well, here, white to play. It is not Karpov's invention, but most players, they prefer to play h3 instead of playing d4. which is the most natural move. It looks to be the natural move in the position. Why? Well, white's main idea was to have a classical pawn center, right? But why doesn't white play d4 right away? The reason is, in this position, if white plays d4, black will play bishop g4, and that brings us to a very important concept. That is, when white has a classical center and that is blocked by black's pawns, it is in white's interest to preserve the center and to preserve the option of either capturing or pushing the pawn. White wants to keep this option for as long as possible so that black has to be ready to face either of the move. He has to be very careful. For instance, black cannot play in this position bishop e6 because he would lose a piece to d5. And he cannot play the move knight somewhere because he would lose the e5 pawn. So here it's in white's interest to have these pawns and to have the threat of d5 or de5 at favorable moment. And black would like white to commit to one of the moves so that he does not have to worry about the other move. So here black would play bishop g4, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Okay, black's idea is to capture. He has pinned the knight on f3 and his idea is to capture on f3 the next move. For instance, if white plays, let us suppose white plays h3. Black would take on f3 and now white has to either sacrifice the pawn. I mean, if he recaptures with the queen, he would lose the d4 pawn. Or if he takes with the pawn, then the king side has been miserably weakened. Black can play some move like say knight h5 and gradually enter into white's position by occupying the f4 square, h4 square, because there's no pawn to control these squares. So, in short, after d4, bishop g4 threatens to disrupt white's center, and this is something which white does not want. That is why white spends a move to prevent bishop g4, and only then he would occupy the center. Karpov played h3, and well, although d4 is playable and there are many strong grandmasters who do play d4 from time to time, but the move h3 is more common. Now let us go to the next position, that is after 12th move by black. Here it is white to play. Normally after white builds up his center, black has various options how to deal with white's center. So here black has preferred to put his pawn on c5, and basically he is threatening to open the c file by taking cd at the right moment. Well, in this particular position or in this type of positions, white has mainly three options. Either he can ignore black's threat and continue with his development, that is development of this bishop by playing knight f1 and placing the knight favorably, this knight favorably on g3 square or e3 square by playing knight f1 and knight g3, and that is how white intends to develop. So either he can ignore black's threats or he can take de5, or in some positions he pushes d5. In this game, knight f1 was not a good option, because in this case black can win this d pawn and white cannot retake knight d4 because he would lose his bishop after knight d4, queen d4, queen c2. Therefore white decided to push d5. So the move d5 in many positions in closed Ruy Lopez opening it defines the future course of the game. White takes space, but he does away with his option of taking on e5. So here white played d5 and pushed the knight back. Well, the next important moment of the game, instructive moment of the game rather, is after knight d8, black returned. Now, another very important concept in Ruy Lopez, that is in general, and it applies not only to Ruy Lopez, any other openings. Development means bringing out all the pieces, and the final piece, normally the final piece which comes out at the end is the rook. The rook on a1 is likely to be the last piece which will develop after white brings out his knight, the bishop, moves his queen, then the rook is centralized. But there are occasions when we have shortcut to development of the rooks. And if the rooks can develop without moving the bishops, then it's very easy. We can complete our development quite quickly because the bishops can be active on an open diagonal even from its original square. Okay, here white played the move which is very common in Ruy Lopez, that is a4. He uses the b5 pawn to his advantage and he opens the rook file. He activates the rook even from its original square. So the move a4, although it's a very natural move, it's a very common move in many positions in Ruy Lopez opening, but it is very important from conceptual point of view, activating the rook from its original square. Well, after that, the next important position is after the 15th move by black. White has successfully opened his A line, activated the rook, and now it is white to play. I feel this is one of the most important moves in the whole game. White to play. For the experienced players who are watching this video, I would ask them to pause the video for some time and guess what they would play if they were white. Karpov. Well, one of the hallmarks of any good player is they not only plan their moves well, but they also read the opponent's minds and anticipate opponent's plans. So here, the most natural move or normal move would have been knight f1, regrouping, or rather activating the knight to g3, bringing both the pieces on the king side and trying to hop in from f5 or h5 to attack the black king. So that is how normally white shifts his pieces gradually. But in this particular position, Karpov anticipated that black would have played c4 with the intention of placing this knight, which does not have a single good square. All these squares are controlled by white's pawns, but he would instead plant the knight to c5. From c5 the knight would be very active. It would put pressure on e4, but also plan to jump on d3, b3 or a4, supported by his pawns at the right moment. So the knight on c5 would be a very active piece. In order to prevent black's plan, Karpov played a very instructive move, that is b4. The move b4 takes away the c5 square from the knight. Now the knight can go to b7, but it won't be able to come to c5. The knight remains passive. So it is a very nice move which Karpov played before continuing his normal plan of knight f1. He prevents opponent's plans. Now after bishop f8, the next critical position, we see both sides have by and large carried on their plan and they have regrouped their pieces successfully. The only bad piece for one of the sides is the knight on b7, which continues to suffer. It doesn't have a single good square to go, thanks to white's b4. Now in this position, we shall learn how to occupy or gain control of open lines. Here A file is the only open file in the board. Well, of course, black has an option of opening the C file, but at present A file is the only line which is open. White played the move. It's a very instructive move, and in similar positions we can always try this kind of ideas. White played the move Rook A2. Here at present both sides are in control over the A file, but it's white to play, and white intends to double his rook on the A file so that he can gain control of the A file and penetrate into black's position through the squares A7 or A6. So in this particular position, if black captures Rook A2, white will be happy to take back with the queen, and then black is not in a position to challenge the A file. White will play Rook A1, Queen A7 and enter into black's position. So the move Rook A2 is another concept we need to remember. Now to the most important moment of the game. Here black successfully halted white's doubling of rook by playing c4, and now it seems it is black who is trying to take over the A file by first exchanging and then bringing the other rook to A8. So that is black's idea. It is white to play. How do you prevent that idea? It's a very instructive moment. I would like all of you to pause this video for a while and find out the best move for white in this position. Karpov played a move which has become a trademark of Karpov, that is bishop to A7. It's a deceptively simple move, very simple move, not much calculation needed, but only with this move he squeezes the black's rook in such a manner that the rook doesn't have any square and white is in possession of space. White can now double his rook and at the right time move his bishop back and enter into black's position. So this move is perhaps, well, you can say the most important move of the whole game. And this idea of squeezing black by simple move taking space, bishop A7, has become a trademark of Anatoly Karpov. Well, after that, we go to the next important moment of this game, that is after 29th move, it is white to play. Now you see white has doubled on the A file successfully and he is almost on the verge of taking the A file by removing the bishop at the right moment. It is white to play. You can pause the video for a while and guess white's next move. Well, this is a very important concept which white does. White plays F4, which is a very, very instructive move. Now, white has a distinct space advantage. What does it mean? It simply means the pawn on d5 is cramping black's pieces. So the reason why space advantages is Well, black has only these two squares through which it can shift his pieces from king side to queen side and vice versa. So black does not have much space to transfer the pieces compared to white. White can at ease, White can at ease move his pieces from queen side to king side and king side to queen side without resistance from his pawns. So a player in possession of space advantage should aim to transfer the attack from one side of the board to other, so that he keeps on shifting his pieces faster. The opponent will be slower to bring his pieces from one side to other, and we can have a distinct advantage in number of pieces to attack. So white played f4. He is opening the other side of the board to attack. He is not only attacking on the queen side, but he intends to enlarge the sphere of attack. Well, basically, if black captures ef4, it seems black will gain because the bishop's diagonal will be opened. That is true, but at the same time, even white will gain possession of d4 square for his knight. This knight can then hop on to d4 and then keep pressure on b5 square as b5 pawn as well as c6 square. So the move f4 is perfectly playable and ef4 is not a good idea. Well, now another very important concept, that is after move 31st by black. This is the 32nd move of white. It seems black has managed to successfully defend, somehow keep the position locked, and he is waiting for white to show his hand. How does white improve his position? See, in this position, it's a very important concept. It is the concept of good and bad bishops. Both sides have two bishops, right? The bishop on a1, b1 and a7, and for black it is e8 and g7. Well, if we simply note that out of these two bishops, this bishop, the bishop on g7, resembles a pawn. The bishop on g7 has no good diagonal. It's restricted by his own pawns. And all the pawns are restricted to the bishop is imprisoned. But in contrast, the e8 bishop is actually having good diagonal and is controlling some important squares, especially the square f7, h5 and even g6. So in order to get rid of that, we call the e8 bishop good bishop because it is complementing these pawns, and the bishop on g7 a bad bishop because it overlaps with the same function of the pawns. So white decides to exchange or eliminate the good bishop of black so that he can enter into black's position. So he plans he will bring his bishop from b1 to h5 in order to exchange this bishop. So he embarks on a very lengthy maneuver, that is, he played bishop c2. Black has to simply wait for white's idea. He doesn't have any active plan. White played knight g3 and bishop d1, and after that bishop h5. So this is the way how white entered into black's position, and finally we shall see the last move, or maybe the second last move of the game. That is, in this position it is white to play. How did white finish the game? White simply played queen g6 with the intention of playing knight h5, attacking this, and in these positions, if black exchanges the queen, well, in this particular position Unzicker played King f8 waited and white played knight h5 and black resigned. And it is really very attractive position because it's a picturesque position, because with so many pieces on the board, black is not even a pawn down. But because he has been squeezed so much, he lacks so much space that he had no option but to resign. Well, in this position, had black captured on g6, white would have retaken with the f pawn, and this knight on e3, which was a few moves back, was on h2, has been brought to this square. The reason is now it will gain access to f5 square, and both these knights will coordinate to win either this pawn or this pawn or this pawn or even this piece. Black would lose material, so he decided to resign. So we saw a very instructive game by Anatoly Karpov, who went on to become a world champion in less than a year after this game, and he was indeed a worthy world champion. But what we learned from this game is how to make use of space advantage in the Ruy Lopez opening.